What if I told you that much of the modern Middle East was created not by its own people, but by two European men drawing lines on a secret map during World War I? Their names were Mark Sykes and François Georges-Picot, and in 1916, their agreement divided up the lands of the dying Ottoman Empire between Britain and France. It was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and it remains one of the most infamous deals in history, a symbol of betrayal, colonial ambition, and borders drawn without regard for the people who lived there. This is the story of how the Middle East we know today was born in secrecy, double-dealing, and imperial ambition. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was widely called the sick man of Europe. Once stretching from Budapest to Baghdad, it had been in steady decline for more than a century, losing wars, land, and influence. Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania had broken away in the 19th century. Italy seized Libya in 1911, and the Balkan Wars of 1912–13 had driven the Ottomans almost entirely out of Europe. Yet despite this decline, the Ottomans were still a major power in the Middle East, and their position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia meant they were both courted and feared by the great powers. For much of the 19th century, Britain and France were traditional partners of the Ottomans. Why? Because they feared something more than Ottoman weakness: Russian expansion. Russia had long dreamed of seizing Constantinople and the Straits to reach the Mediterranean. To block this, Britain and France supported the Ottomans as a counterweight, most famously in the Crimean War of the 1850s, when British and French troops fought alongside the Ottomans against Russia. But by 1914, relations between the Ottomans and their old Western partners were badly strained. European powers had taken Ottoman lands for themselves. France had taken control of Tunisia in 1881. Britain had occupied Egypt in 1882. Both had carved out spheres of influence in the Middle East. In Istanbul, many saw Britain and France not as protectors, but as predators circling the dying empire. Then came the final humiliation: the seizure of two Ottoman battleships. In 1914, the Ottoman government had ordered two modern dreadnoughts, Sultan Osman I and Reshidiyeh, from British shipyards, paid for largely by public donations from ordinary Ottoman citizens. These ships symbolized hope for restoring the empire's naval power. But when war broke out in August 1914, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, seized the ships for the Royal Navy. The Ottomans got no refund, and the public felt betrayed. This single act did enormous damage to Anglo-Ottoman relations. Crowds rioted in Istanbul, and anti-British sentiment soared. Just days later, Germany offered a spectacular gesture. The battlecruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau sailed into Ottoman waters, evaded British pursuit, and were gifted to the empire. Renamed Yavuz Sultan Selim and Midilli, they became symbols of a new friendship with Berlin. By the autumn of 1914, the choice was made. Germany had given the Ottomans ships, military advisors, and respect. Britain and France had taken ships away, seized territory, and treated the empire as a carcass to be carved. On October 29, 1914, Ottoman warships attacked Russian ports on the Black Sea. The empire had entered World War I on the side of Germany. By 1916, it was clear to Britain and France that the Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe, was doomed to collapse. The war in the Middle East was still raging, but Allied leaders were already thinking about how to divide Ottoman lands once victory came. This was not unusual for the age. The First World War, like wars before it, was fought not only on battlefields, but also in diplomatic backrooms where empires planned their rewards in advance. The task of drawing up the division fell to two men, Mark Sykes and François Georges-Picot. Sykes was a British diplomat and politician with years of experience in Middle Eastern affairs. He had traveled widely in the Ottoman provinces, and in London he became the Foreign Office's expert on how best to secure Britain's interests in the region. Picot was a French diplomat whose country had long claimed cultural and religious ties with Syria and Lebanon through missionaries, bankers, and merchants. Together, they sat down to decide what would happen to vast swathes of territory that neither of their countries controlled yet, but which they expected soon would. The result was the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. France insisted on Syria and Lebanon, seeing them as part of its historic sphere of influence. Britain demanded Mesopotamia, rich in oil, and Palestine, strategically vital to protect the Suez Canal and Britain's route to India. A line was drawn across a map of the Ottoman Middle East, slicing the empire into zones of French and British control. Russia, still in the war at that point, was promised eastern Anatolia, including coveted access to the Straits. Later, Italy would be promised its own share of Ottoman land to keep it loyal to the Allies. What is striking when looking at the Sykes-Picot map is how artificial it was. The Ottoman Empire had long been divided into administrative provinces, but these boundaries bore little relation to ethnic, tribal, or religious realities on the ground. Sykes and Picot cared even less about such realities. They drew borders to maximize imperial advantage, securing oil, ports, and trade routes, while paying little attention to the peoples who actually lived there. Kurds, Arabs, Armenians, Turks, and countless smaller communities were cut apart or lumped together in states that had never existed before. The agreement was secret because both governments knew how it would look if revealed. Britain was, at the very same time, encouraging Arab leaders like Sharif Hussein of Mecca to rise against the Ottomans with promises of an independent Arab kingdom. France and Britain spoke publicly of freedom and self-determination, but in private, they had already decided to carve up the region for themselves. When the Bolsheviks published the treaty after the Russian Revolution, the world saw the betrayal in black and white, and the map of the Middle East was never the same again. While Mark Sykes and François Georges-Picot were busy sketching secret lines across the Middle East, Britain was playing another game entirely. In Cairo, British officials were in correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the hereditary guardian of Islam's holiest cities. Hussein was ambitious. He dreamed of ruling a vast Arab kingdom stretching from Syria to Yemen. The British, desperate to weaken the Ottoman Empire from within, encouraged him. In a series of letters exchanged between 1915 and 1916 with Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Hussein was promised that if the Arabs rose in revolt against Ottoman rule, London would recognize and support the creation of an independent Arab kingdom after the war. The promise was deliberately vague, but Hussein believed his dream was within reach. When the Arab revolt began in June 1916, with British gold and guns and the guidance of officers like T. E. Lawrence, so-called Lawrence of Arabia, Hussein's forces struck against the Ottomans. The revolt was difficult, but symbolically powerful. Arabs tore up railway lines, seized Aqaba, and raised the flag of independence. They believed they were fighting for their own future. What Hussein and his followers did not know was that, months earlier, the Sykes-Picot Agreement had already decided the fate of the very lands they thought they were liberating. Britain and France had no intention of handing them over to an Arab kingdom. Instead, those lands were marked out in colored zones on a secret map in a Paris office. The contradiction was staggering. On the one hand, Britain promised Arab independence. On the other, it promised the same land to France. And to make things even more complicated, in 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, yet another overlapping promise to yet another group. When the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia and published the secret Sykes-Picot documents in late 1917, the Arab world was stunned. Newspapers from Damascus to Baghdad printed the map. The betrayal was undeniable. As historian James Barr observed, the Arabs discovered that while they were shedding blood for freedom, Britain and France had already sold their lands to each other. This double dealing left a legacy of bitterness. For many Arabs, the Sykes-Picot Agreement became the symbol of Western treachery, the moment when their hopes for independence were sacrificed to imperial ambition. When the First World War ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire was shattered. Its armies had collapsed, its capital was occupied, and its Arab provinces were in Allied hands. For the Arab leaders who had joined the revolt, this seemed like the moment of triumph. Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his sons, particularly Faisal, who had marched with British support into Damascus in 1918, believed the dream of an independent Arab kingdom was finally within reach. But behind the scenes, a very different vision was taking shape. The wartime agreements, Sykes-Picot, the Balfour Declaration, and secret understandings with Italy and Greece had already carved up the Middle East. All that remained was to find a way to justify this division in the new international order. The solution was the mandate system created by the newly founded League of Nations. In theory, a mandate was not a colony. It was presented as a trust. Advanced nations would administer territories until such time as they are able to stand alone. In reality, it was colonialism under a new name. At the San Remo Conference in April 1920, the Allies turned the vague lines of Sykes-Picot into official assignments. Britain received control over Iraq and Palestine. This included Transjordan, which was carved out of Palestine in 1921 to be ruled by Emir Abdullah, one of Hussein's sons. Britain also secured oil rights in Mesopotamia, one of the main reasons it had pushed for Iraq. France was given a mandate over Syria and Lebanon. In practice, this meant the creation of a greater Lebanon with new borders, designed to give Maronite Christians a state under French protection and a divided Syria that was easier for Paris to control. Palestine was placed under British mandate, with the text explicitly including the terms of the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Britain was committed to establishing a national home for the Jewish people there, while supposedly protecting the rights of the Arab population. Meanwhile, Britain and France promised Italy territories in Anatolia, and Greece occupied Smyrna, arrangements that fueled the Turkish War of Independence under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. For Arab leaders, the mandates were nothing less than betrayal. The Syrian National Congress, which met in Damascus in 1920, declared Syria independent with Faisal as king. But French forces soon invaded, defeating Faisal's army at the Battle of Maysalun in July 1920 and exiling him. France then imposed its mandate, breaking the short-lived dream of Syrian self-rule. In Iraq, British rule provoked a massive revolt in 1920. Tribes rose up against taxation and foreign soldiers, forcing Britain to deploy tens of thousands of troops and use air power to suppress the rebellion. The cost convinced London to adjust its approach. Rather than direct colonial rule, Britain installed Faisal, now displaced from Syria, as king of Iraq in 1921, under a monarchy tied closely to British advisors. In Palestine, discontent grew rapidly. Arabs who had expected independence discovered instead that Britain was not only ruling them, but also facilitating Zionist immigration under the Balfour Declaration. Tensions between Arabs and Jews escalated almost immediately, setting the stage for a conflict that continues to this day. The French in Syria used a strategy of divide and rule. They split the territory into separate states, Damascus, Aleppo, the Alawite state, and Jabal Druze, hoping to prevent unified resistance. In Lebanon, they expanded the borders to include Muslim areas alongside the Maronite Christian heartland, creating a state that would be permanently fragile but dependent on French support. The British, for their part, prioritized imperial strategy. Iraq was valuable for its oil and for its position along the route to India. Palestine was essential for guarding the Suez Canal. Transjordan was a buffer state, ruled cheaply by Abdullah with British subsidies. Independence was granted only in name. The real power remained in London. In conclusion, the mandates, which were born out of Sykes-Picot Agreement, were the final act of the wartime bargain, a way to disguise imperial conquest under the language of international responsibility. To Arabs, they marked the betrayal of 1916. To Britain and France, they secured oil, trade routes, and influence. And to the modern Middle East, they left a legacy of artificial borders and bitter grievances that still echo today. The story of Sykes-Picot and the mandates is not just about one war or one treaty. It is about betrayal and disillusionment, the collision between imperial ambition and national aspiration. And it is a reminder that maps drawn in secret rooms can shape the destiny of millions for generations.